So, hi everyone, how are we feeling? I'm so pleased to welcome you back today for another edition of the Democracy Dialogues. I'm your host, Victoria Couquette. I think we're going to have a pretty amazing conversation today where we're going to try to peel back some layers around a pretty complicated question and hopefully be able to shed light. I think it's no secret that there are lots of whispers about an election coming up, and who you decide to vote for or the process of decision making is an incredibly important one, and especially as those whispers will start to get louder. So it's great to have all of you here, and just like I just introduced myself, I'd love to give you the opportunity as well to say hi to one another. So if you can just use the chat function, say hello, write your name and what organization you're coming from, and that way we can all get to know each other. So as you do that, as I mentioned, we have a pretty big topic here in mind today, deciding who to vote for. This can be especially tough if you're a new or infrequent voter or doing engagement work with that segment. Lots of researchers, commentators, journalists, and great thinkers from all over have attempted to answer this question and chart out a path, but to date, we don't necessarily have easy answers because in truth, it's quite multifaceted. So as a starting point, and to get us all thinking, I'm wondering if I can ask you to take a moment and tell us, where do you get your news and other political information from? Ashley's going to put up that poll in the chat right now, and if you can just take 30 seconds and cast your vote, that would be amazing. Okay, we see some things coming in. So far, the front runner is mainstream media and secondarily social media posts and online opinions. No one's yet saying around the dinner table, but there's a little bit around political party messaging. So this is, I think, really helpful for our conversation today. Thanks everyone for joining in. So we're really lucky today to have two amazing thinkers here with us to help unpack this question. But first, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. So today we're meeting virtually. You may not be on the same ground as me, as I'm currently in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the New Credit Territory. So instead, please join me in acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands we're on today, reflect on the importance of those lands from coast to coast. We do that to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and collaborating in the spirit of reconciliation. And as we all know, these words and their meanings have felt heavier upon us over the past several weeks, although no surprise, but as we're confronted with the reality of Canada's history, as the uncovering of hundreds of unmarked children's graves are uncovered across the country. And as I shared in the last session, as a first generation Canadian myself, my parents come from Australia, which is another white settler colony, and the formerly colonized India and Trinidad and Tobago. So my commitment to a more equitable future is deeply felt. And to expand on that for a moment, we shared some principles last time that we here at the Exchange want to put forward as a shared commitment to the energy and to the dynamic we're co-creating today. So we endeavor to be inclusive, which is at the very core of the mission here at the Exchange, accessible by building a vibrant and inclusive democracy and also removing any barriers of participation, authentic and sustainable. So, that's enough for me. With that in mind, I'd love to introduce our wonderful guests today, Michelle Cormier, journalist and executive director of both the Leaders Debates Commission and the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, and Susan Delacour, renowned journalist and senior writer at the Toronto Star and author of 4 books on Canadian politics. Welcome, Susan and Michelle. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
How are you both doing?
Wonderful. It's great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you. And, as we were talking about on our briefing call, the energy is mounting and the whispers are getting louder. And so, I imagine, election time is one of my favorite times. How are you feeling as all those whispers start to fill the room?
You go first, Michelle. And
well, we're getting ready for whenever the election is called, to be ready for the debates, of course, because we are organizing 2 leaders debates as we did in 2019. So we're gearing up to be election ready whenever the call happens. So there is quite a lot of excitement and a bit of stress around our team right now.
Yeah, I'd say
That's great.
we were discussing yesterday on the call. I don't know what the chemistry or the magic is, but there comes a moment in Ottawa and around political circles where suddenly you realize that an election is inevitable. And we seem to cross that. I was thinking we could even hold off until next year, but in the last few weeks, I don't know what one thing did it, but now we're all just sort of assuming that by the end of the summer, we're going to.
Yeah, well, I guess let's wait and see it. And hopefully maybe by the next Democracy Dialogues, we'll have an even stronger idea. I think that's a good entry point into our discussion today, where we are going to talk about decision-making, voting, being engaged citizens. And we know that people approach us in lots of different ways. I think one anecdote I'd love to start out with is I was actually speaking to a close friend, her name is Shivani, earlier this week. And she shared that when her parents were newcomers, they understood their political identity to be in alignment with voting Conservative because they understood that to be the party of small business owners. And they were small business owners themselves, so it was a literal recognition. But later, as they became more familiar with democracy and with their country and their place in it, they recognized that their values didn't necessarily totally align with that party and that one piece of common ground. So Susan, how can we begin to unpack this? And how are our identities linked to our decision-making, how political parties see us and choose us, and how we see them?
Well, I have written a bit of a book on that.
Yes.
So the phenomenon you describe is what we, Michelle and I and other people in journalism, that's what we want. We want people who change their minds. That's the whole thing about an election. The idea that you are a branded liberal, conservative, New Democrat, Green voter, that's sort of a 20th century idea, even early 20th century idea. I think people don't think of themselves as attached to parties or as one color as much as they did before. And that is very much paralleled in the retail sector too. That people used to buy the same kind of cars or products that their parents did. They don't do that anymore. People are, choice is a huge, huge thing. And elections are about choice. And journalists like me love elections because it is voters getting to say what they choose. And the complicated dynamics of that, some of it is about identity, but I think a lot of it is, I also don't believe it's just your wallets. I don't believe people just vote. The cynical old hardened hacks say that people vote, with their wallets. I think people vote with a complicated mix of their hearts, their heads, their wallets, their families, and just what makes them feel good.
That's an incredible answer. Thank you so much for that. I want to dig into this idea of being the identity of a voter. And as you mentioned, I think we are in a moment of shape shifting and people are exposed to so much information all the time. And to just go into your book a little bit, I just want to talk about some of the ways that people create these identities. So some of the ways we can identify are, as you wrote so brilliantly, taxpayers, citizens, service receivers, shoppers, consumers. What else helps to comprise this list, and how do some of these identities intersect and collide? Do you think the average Canadian is aware of it and how we see ourselves and how political parties see us?
To some degree. I'm glad you asked about that, not just because I wrote a book about it, and that's enough book plugs in one session here. I've actually been wondering whether the pandemic has changed people's identities. And I think there's no question that people see government as having a bigger force and a role in their lives now than they did before March 2020. I think the idea that we are just mere consumers of government, that government is there to give us, sort of deals, has been blown apart a bit by the pandemic. People depended on it. People saw the government as knitting them together. I also do think there was a really interesting dynamic during the pandemic. I almost saw them as two different pandemics from the point of view of consumerism. The 2020 version of the pandemic was everybody had it in their own hands, literally, to change the face of the pandemic. Wash your hands, you know, that governments required citizens to fight the pandemic. Government wasn't them, it was us. Pandemic. And then when the vaccines rolled out, we went back to almost the traditional idea of government is there to give you stuff. And things got ugly again. You know, that the first part of this year was politics as usual again, because the government was back into the role of dispenser of things and never enough things for people. And I kind of liked the political dynamic of 2020 better than 2021 because it was the idea that every citizen had a part in government and in fighting the pandemic. I'd like to see that conversation in the future election rather than the who's got the most vaccines and why aren't we doing enough for people.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Susan. And, you know, Michelle and Susan, but we'll go to Michelle first. We were actually talking about in our briefing call that this might be a pandemic election and that this might actually be the issue of the day. Michelle, do you think that it's primarily going to be centered around what we've all experienced in the last year and a half and what will come? Or do you think that there are certain, you know, stock issues or other issues of the day that will prevail?
Well, I think that the pandemic, or getting, you know, the way that we seem to be moving away from the pandemic will impregnate everything actually of this campaign, whether it's the way that the politicians do campaign, the way that, you know, journalists like Susan cover it. You have real basic decisions. You go out and, you know, on the campaign trail again, how is that going to look like? Even our own debates, you know, this time we're still wondering whether there will be, you know, some studio audience or not. You know, it could be a very bare bones experience coming back to just a studio experience. So that, of course, it impacts it. On the other hand, if you look at the polls now, you know, the economy and the usual, you know, subjects like environment and healthcare are coming back up, you know, as the people's preoccupation. So I don't know what will be left. You know, it depends on when the election will happen. Also, if it's an earlier election, well, I think the pandemic will have more of a presence in there, unless there's another spike, of course, in the middle of a fall campaign. But definitely it will happen. It will have an effect on it. What kind of effect will it have? We're not sure, you know, but, you know, people are learning how to actually consume news or communicate with each other in different ways now. Look at what we're doing today on virtual, you know, screens. So who knows, but certainly it will have an impact.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I want to go back to the idea of, so we've talked about issues, but bringing it back to decision-making just for a second. So largely the exchange here works with people who are new and infrequent voters, and obviously housed in a university, many people will be going to the polls for the first time as well. So how can nonpartisan organizations like us at the exchange here support those new and infrequent voters as they embark on this process? So I guess my question is, in your opinion, what governs sound decision making? Is it a bit of Susan, I'm looking to your book here too, is self-interest, self-image, issues of the day? How can we help to provide some frameworks for how people start to make decisions?
I think this has been one of the downsides of the pandemic. I think just before we came on this call, we were talking about how much we all love the, you know, the shoe leather part of politics. I think the best way to experience politics is face to face with people, with meeting them, talking to people, going out there. I've been a political journalist since the 1980s. Let's say I was a precocious toddler. I have never lost the love of going out there and watching politicians interact with people. So I would tell people, if you want to get into this, there are no stupid questions in politics. There are stupid questions in journalism, but there are none in politics. And go out and actually meet and see the politicians where they live. I come away impressed always with the dedication of politicians to their constituency work too. I think much of what happens in politics is, you know, it's like the iceberg. You know, we cover the tip of it here, but so many MPs and people are doing incredible work out there in their constituencies and have been working really hard during this pandemic to help people. So that's my advice to anybody who wants to dip a toe in the waters. Go out there and meet people. It's a little different with pandemic and crowds and gatherings, but town halls and those things are the best things to attend.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Michelle, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think, I think to Susan's point, we also have, as institutions, whether the media or, our organization, the debates commission, have to be more responsive and reflect more the preoccupations of these people, give them a voice in a sense, right? I mean, we're seeing a whole shift in the media now in terms of how you draw in and address and give voices to the people who feel, outside of politics or society. I think that's a very important trend. In our little sphere of, of institutional politics, the leaders' debates, we're trying to actually reach out to groups who are not interested in politics through, partnerships like your organization, for example, and also in trying to craft or position the debates commission, the debates, as a public institution that belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to the media who produce it, or to the politicians who start it, or to us who actually are, the managers of the exercise. It belongs to the people, and this changes the perspectives. How do you make these debates, in that sense, meaningful for people who don't feel they belong in politics, or who don't feel that their preoccupations are met? And it's a huge challenge. But I think, if we change our perspective and try to address these preoccupations, I think that will go a long way in trying to draw people in and make them feel at home in the political system.
So interesting. Thank you, Michelle. And do you think that, with Susan's point in mind about really being able to be face-to-face and understand your stake in your community and your stake in politics and really see yourself as a political actor, do you think that this year, especially the Canadian leadership debates, can help with that? Because we may have a lack of the ability to be face-to-face and have those interactions. So that's my first question. And my second question is, what role do the leadership debates really play in helping Canadians make informed decisions based on sound information?
Yeah, well, we start from the point that, we're in a different news and information environment. There's a lot of misinformation, of disinformation, of false information going around. So, how can they find their way to get the genuine information? So if you actually manage to get 5 or 6 leaders in the same room, live on television, with no disruption or no mediation by any other groups or media, that it's just, what you see there is what they're saying. Actually, it's not being mitigated in any way. I think that's already a start. But then you need to actually have eyeballs. You need people actually tune in and watch it. So this was our first challenge in 2019, and we were very happy because we got record numbers. 19 million Canadians tuned into the 2 debates, which is, half the voters, basically, or half the population, actually. So it was a lot of voters. So this is what we're trying to do. But at the same time, we're also trying to make sure that, people don't feel cynical about these experiences. And that's why in the surveys we did prior and after the debates, people told us the 2 things that worried them or displeased them is that, the leaders didn't answer the questions. They pivoted to their attack lines or their points, their campaign points, too quickly. And secondly, of course, they talked over each other. So this is one of the things we're trying to can't do away with it, but trying to improve for the next experience, so that people have a sense that they get, real answers to the questions they have. And hopefully this will increase the trust and credibility in the institution of debates, and of course in institutions in the political system also.
That's so interesting, Michelle. You anticipated some of my questions about what Canadians criticize about debates. But I want to help kind of guide the experience too, so that when people are watching, they can zero in on some questions they have. So what do you think leaders are hoping to accomplish during the debates? And what do you think a voter needs to hear from them to either make up or change their minds, or even, build up that trust? What should people be watching and listening for?
The good thing about the last debates, and you know, in the surveys we did after, is that a lot of people actually told us that it made a difference come election day. That it was a, you know, an important decision point for them. So our intention is try to increase the number of people who feel that way. But like I said, I think, you know, we need as an organization and you know, with the journalists who actually host these debates and even the politicians who are involved in these debates to try to make an effort so people can get clear answers and real answers to the questions that they have. You know, this is about policy. It's not really about politics. You can score points and it could make a difference, but I think what the research shows us is that, you know, a politician has a lot to gain in answering and giving real information on their positions and policies, so people can actually differentiate leaders. So hopefully this will you know, keep progressing. But it's you know, it's a tall order, of course.
Absolutely, it's a process. Susan, I'm interested to come to you now. And we know that you've worn many hats during elections and during leadership debates, as well as a moderator, as a journalist, as an observer, as a, you know, as many different kind of representatives of some of the stakeholders. Do you think it's about policy? Do you think it's about performativity? Are people watching for temperament? What are some of the other things that, for better or for worse, are inherently part of this debate process?
Well, you know, there's the famed cliche in journalism. Michel's probably going to plug his ears over there. The knockout punch, right? But,
yeah, that's true.
Keeps this talk of the knockout punch. You know, it makes it appear as though these debates are a game, which they are to some extent.
Yeah.
But they're more than that. I'm not sure that you're going to settle matters of great policy in a 90-minute or 2-hour debate. I don't know that the future of the country is going to be determined during them. But I think you touched on some of the things that people are watching for is it is not wrong to want politicians to be good performers. That is part of their job. So it is totally realistic and reasonable to judge them on how well they perform, even if they stand up straight, right? Or
I'll sit up a little straighter.
But I think, you know, we say before every debate that we do not ask for the knockout punch. That's not what they're all about. Print reporters like me really hate debate night because first of all, you've got 2 hours that you've got to sort out there and make a really snap decision on what happened. You know, you can't replay the whole thing. They are very much TV events. The leaders now, with social media too, are using these debates as raw material for things they put out later. You know, that it used to be, you'd get a press release from every party saying they won the debate the night of the debate. And then that was the end of it. And the journalist said, we'll decide. But now they put these things out on Twitter for days and days later. Here's the little clip. So the politicians are very conscious going into this debate that they have not only the audience that night, but an audience days and days and days ahead to show their little clip to, or the little moment. So it's I guess the gift that keeps on giving for them if they do it properly. But a gaffe too can last a lot longer than debate night as well.
Right. I think you're right to say that those sound bites can have the longevity and marketing power that really carries people through a campaign. So another thing I'm interested in is I think more and more people are less willing to be talked at rather than talked with or have their voices incorporated. Michel, can this be a two-way process between the leaders and Canadians? And how does the Debates Commission really engage the voices of normal and everyday Canadians?
Well, it's you know, of course it's a very difficult question, and you know, debates are only one part of the whole election campaign. I don't want to put push influence that everything goes through the debates, right? In terms of decision making, you know, the obvious things that we do in debates is that, you know, the journalist panel who actually decide on the questions, well, they will ask people to send in questions, and you know, many of these questions are actually the ones that are suggested, right? And secondly, there are ordinary Canadians who actually ask questions during the debate. This is now a kind of a feature of debate, and it's not, you know, this is quite, it's not unique, but it's quite one of the features of Canadian debates. You know, it's become almost a tradition now. So I know this is an imperfect way of going about it, but there is more. There is attention to these possibilities of having at least an interaction between people and the leaders live on stage. Otherwise, you know, like Susan says, also now there are many ways for people to get engaged in the political process, and it's not just about, you know, engaging with the leaders either. It's about their local candidates. It's about, you know, getting into politics, getting into issues, and getting interested to discuss this either with their families, their friends, or with, you know, in larger groups and committees or organizations.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that whole ecosystem of engagement and decision making a little bit later on as well. But first, I want to talk about the evolution of debates and the digital first world that we're living in. So increasingly, less and less people, as we know, have cable. So how are debates going to meet people where they're at? And, you know, is this a Canadian, historically, it's been a bit of a Canadian tradition to gather around the TV screen with your family. So do you think this will continue to be a unifying event, or will it be more fragmented as we see in the online world?
Well, I think people will continue to watch it in many different forms on many different services and screens. Hopefully, you know, we could actually continue to have a unique and common experience of people on the same date, if you like. You know, last time we had 19 million people who actually tuned in. You know, most of them tuned in on traditional media, on the big TV networks who are producing the debates, right? The CBC, Global, CTV, Radio-Canada, and the others. But, you know, we had, so out of the, you know, for example, the English debate, we had 14 million people watching. 3.6 of them watched on digital, and 9.6 on traditional television, and people, almost a million on radio, you know, so people still like the radio apparently, or stuck in their cars, I don't know. But that's important. The other thing that, you know, that's changed is that now the signal, you know, the signal of the debate, the feed, doesn't belong to anybody. It's available free of charge to anybody who wants to stream it, whether it's a student council, an organization like yours, any media who are not part of the partnership of the production. Anybody can actually use that feed and broadcast it the way they want. So that's one way of actually reaching more people. And we also offer the debates in many languages in translation, like in Punjabi, Italian, Arabic, Chinese, and a host of indigenous languages, to make sure that, you know, these communities who often you know, feel either left out or not as engaged in the political debate have the way to actually consume this debate in their own language, and hopefully that, you know, makes them feel more part of the process or more engaged.
Yeah, I think you're right to say that that absolutely helps to reduce informational barriers. And having worked in an election administration myself, that's a huge piece to the accessibility and the inclusion of all people who are in Canada. So now I want to talk about people who don't actually really tune in or care or think that their lives are not political. I think a lot of people see themselves as, you know, their lives not touching the political. So how do we reach them? And I don't know who I'm talking about when I say we. How are they reached and prompted to engage? And what do they need to know, and as they're making their decision of potentially who to root for, what their stakes are in it? Susan, did you want to respond?
Yeah, we touched on this again too. I'm wondering, I'm going to be watching in the next election to see whether the pandemic has changed that for people. You know, that I think it's a little harder to be cynical about government after the last 16 months we've been through. And so I'm wondering, for example, I was saying this to my spouse the other night, I'm wondering if incumbent MPs, you know, the people who've been working basically in their ridings out of their basements for the last 16 months, have a bigger advantage going into the next election because they've had to do so much work on the ground. They haven't been haven't had to go to Ottawa and do all the stupid stuff that MPs have to do here. Some exceptions, but most of the time they've been in their ridings working. And
Right.
that, I wonder if that's changed. I don't know the answer to that. I'm watching for it though. I don't know whether that's made it a little bit harder to say that politics has nothing to do with your life or that it's not important. And I think that's a harder argument for people to make post March 2020.
I think that things certainly feel more tangible now. We have that lived experience of it feeling less like abstract, and as we see things actually affecting our lives in real time, that quite frankly didn't really affect us in the same way before. What I'm going to call playoff viewers. So people, a writ is dropped and everybody gets excited about the election, and now we're all speaking political. But I kind of have a two-part question there too. So does it seem a little bit late to be part of the policy process at that point, because it's been set? What advice do you have for playoff viewers, and how can we post-election and in between elections keep up a culture of engagement when it's not election time?
I love that expression, playoff viewers, myself, and I don't mind playoff politics. Whatever gets you interested. I think it's not just a condition of politics, I think, but it definitely is. We're seeing it. It's very hard to sustain attention on one thing for a long time. I think about the things that people have, it took George Floyd's murder in the United States for something to pull things up, but they did. 4 weeks ago, we were talking about this horrible death in London, and that's all we were talking about, the family in London. And we haven't talked about that at all in 2 weeks or so. So I don't know what, this is my elaborate way of saying, I'm not sure that we're able to sustain attention for a long time on anything, but what you do have to hope is that the experience they had during the playoffs and is enough to keep them, just a little bit of a thread of interest so that they recognize and can check back in. But expecting people to have the same level of interest in politics as I do, or we do, or the people on this event do, I think is probably, people have lives to live, and things to do. But I guess we don't need to have full attention.
I think, the work that your organization does between elections and other groups like civics, we do curriculum for civic education for kids in school, and apathy is boring, that reaches out to other young people who don't feel part of the process, or l'Institut du Nouveau Monde in Quebec, who has these policies to engage a new generation in politics and policy, I think is vital. So I think, if that can be encouraged. At the commission, we don't have that mandate, but we certainly sometimes talk about how wonderful it would be if we could, nurture a kind of a culture of debates between elections, not between the leaders and the ministers and the political stars, but even in local communities. If in your neighborhood, or if in your city or ward, or school council, people, a culture of debates and debating issues publicly and getting engaged in the process can be developed. I think that's one way to do it. But I think, like I said, a lot of work from your organization and others like that, I think, helps a lot in developing people who actually are engaged in policy and politics.
Michelle, you raised an important point about the leadership debates and also about local candidates and the importance of investment there. Do you think that local candidate debates should be televised and streamed as well? Because the reason I ask you is that when we televise and put the attention of mass media just onto leaders, does this have the risk of turning the focus of our system into a more presidential style of campaign rather than the parliamentary system? Because when you think about it, there's a major decline in local news media. And those are the people who tend to cover the candidates that people are actually voting for in their communities and who's leading them. So, what is the tension there between focusing on leaders versus local candidates?
Well, I think, you can do both. It's not one or the other. I mean,
Mhm.
I think a leader's debate is important as a feature of political campaigns when people decide on, the leadership of the country, or the people who actually are going to get involved in developing policy as opposition parties in the House of Commons. At the same time, if you can develop, writings that, debates at many other levels, I think it's important. In the last election, there's an environmental group who organized 100 debates, 100 local debates in constituencies, to discuss environmental issues, climate change, and what to do about it. And I think that's very important. And these things actually build on the same momentum of debates. They're not opposites, or they don't compete with each other. They can
Right.
very well coexist. And I think it's better for everybody.
And perhaps that's a way to build out more infrastructure of more regular engagement. What about political polling? To what extent do you think it motivates people or fires them up or just makes them feel?
I'll defer to Susan on that one.
I have a rant about this.
Please rant away, Susan.
When I was doing my book, sorry, I promised I wouldn't mention it, but I had a fascinating epiphany. And I was going back and reading all the newspaper and journalistic coverage from the 1970s and 80s, and realizing how much journalism was keeping up with the changes in polling and the innovation of polling. And so much so, journalists, news organizations were commissioning their own polls as well, so that we knew as much about voters as the political parties. That there was an even thing there. We lost that battle in the 2000s. We are way behind. And because of the big data campaign style now, accumulating information about voters, those voter databases, the algorithms, the way they fight campaigns, we don't know as much about the electorate as the political parties. And
Right.
We have to get our game up on this. And it's expensive, but it's like we are covering elections as though they're still fought with, polls from the 1970s. They're not. And polling, I don't know, has a huge influence on people anymore too, but I did I'll stop after this. I decided after the last election to do a big article on how the Liberals won. And I learned so many things in this interview that had passed right over our heads during the campaign. For example, the Liberals put out, they don't do national advertising all the time. They put out these little pocket ads in micro-targeting the audiences they wanted, and we didn't see them. So I think we've got to get better at figuring out how to cover a micro-targeted campaign that they all fight. Otherwise, they're just going to run rings around us.
Yeah, and I really want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Susan's book, because really learning about the way that we're micro-targeted, the way that we're like mass marketed to, the way that they're really seeing us as, types. I had to chuckle when I read about Zoe. Zoe's, and for everyone listening, Zoe is a political type and has a particular, personality feature, likes and dislikes, and political affiliation. That resonated with me, and I felt maybe not so unique in that moment, but it was certainly illuminating. Yeah, please feel free to comment.
That illustrates this, and I've been banging my little tin cup against the bars about this. I guess there was a flurry of commentary in the last campaign that Liberals weren't doing enough negative ads. And the commentary was coming from Toronto, where they didn't need to do negative ads, but they were doing negative ads in rural areas and in Saskatchewan. And again, if you are just covering a campaign out of Toronto or out of Ottawa, just looking out on the big flat national thing, you are not seeing the election as it's unfolded in all its complexity.
Right. Yeah, I was really interested also to learn about how some political parties, and specifically what we talk about in your book, is that conservatives at one point or perhaps continue to actually micro-target those who are less politically engaged as well as their ideal voter, and can really more try to have some moment of recognition in their lifestyle as Tim Hortons, goers rather than Starbucks goers as well. So that was an interesting point.
Barack Obama won this way, and the Liberals and New Democrats have been working a lot with the Democrats in the United States, importing some. The woman who advised the American Democrat who did a big advisory role with Trudeau in 2014, 2015, spoke at his Montreal convention, is now an assistant chief of staff to Joe Biden. So there's lots of traffic in this between the Democratic and progressive parties on doing this, and it's exactly the audience you're talking about. They're looking for people who've never voted before, because that's how you change the game.
Right. So I want to ask you about one more theme about representation and our own biases, and then we'll transition to some questions. So at this point, I just want to do a shout out to our audience to say, please send some in to Ashley. This is your chance to hear from two incredible people who do incredible work. So, ask away, and we'll get there in about 3 or 4 minutes. So as I said, and Susan, thank you for touching on this, the racial pandemic really that we've seen in the past year and a half as well. I want to ask you both a little bit about our own unconscious biases and who we, for better or for worse, are conditioned to think should hold power and authority, and who's meant to represent us. Just anecdotally, my 93-year-old grandmother, who I love and respect very, very much, has been quite conditioned, I'll be honest and say, because she was born into colonialism, and as a result thinks that tall white men are the pinnacle of authority. And I think that that's how many of us hold these unconscious biases. So how can we address this in the whole political process, including the leadership debates, which are another place for people to kind of see leadership in action? And how do we, work against the danger of reinforcing those biases and internal stereotypes of who is meant to lead and represent us? I know that's a hard question, but I guess if I were to put it simply, how can we get past the superficial, or are those visual images still too overwhelmingly powerful? I'm not sure who wants to take that one. I know it's a big one.
If we're talking about the for example, the next leaders debates, I think diversity, what people, who people see on the stage, I think is important. And you have more diversity in leaders now that we've, I think, ever had. Same thing with the people who will be on stage as journalists and moderator. For example, AP, there will be an Indigenous journalist on stage to ask questions this time for the first time in debates. And I think it's a prescient moment to have that, and it's important. And we have to continue to be aware of and attentive to inclusiveness and diversity of every kind. And I think. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of ground to gain, but I think there is I think a realization now across the board that this is not only important, but it's long overdue. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you for that. And Susan, I want to ask you before we transition to the questions, what about other forms of social conditioning, like ethnic bloc voting or voting who your parents voted for as a matter of course, or even strategic voting, so voting against someone rather than for them? What are your thoughts? A big question too, I know. I saved the hardest ones for last.
Yeah, I'm more worried about not voting, frankly. I'll take the easy way out of that question, because I'm not so worried about the reason for people voting. I'm more worried about the reasons for not voting. Whatever gets you into that voting booth, works for me. I think that's where we've got to start. And we have been moving up in Canada, which is really encouraging. That voter turnout is up. It was on Indigenous communities turned out huge amounts of people in 2015. I think it was it dipped a little bit in 2019, but I don't think it's going back. I think
Mhm.
work has been done on that. And yeah, that's just get out and vote.
I appreciate that. And so my last question before we transition to the audience questions is I'm hoping a bit of a fun one. So bearing in mind that the writ's going to be called at almost any moment, what are 3 things that you're reading or listening to that we can recommend to the audience here to get more energized, better informed, and really in that spirit of democracy?
You go first, Michelle.
Well, they're, for the junkies, or, they're people who will follow the race. There are a number of podcasts that are out there that are developing that are really, I think, very, very interesting and engaging and, very smart. So, this is one of the things I'm looking for. We're looking at the polls a lot at the commission because we have to make decisions relative to the polls, but that's kind of a deformation. Maybe I wouldn't recommend people do that all the time. And I think by and large, reading thought pieces rather than just the news feed on your Twitter account, I think is important. Like, read Susan Delacourte's pieces of analysis and other journalists like that. And also new journalists who come from a different perspective. There are plenty of new fabulous, media websites now that take a different perspective, different take on issues and politics in general, which I think is very important. So that's my kind of 3 things.
Thank you, Michelle. Susan?
I don't know that I have exactly 3, but I would say further to my
I won't hold you to it.
further to my rant about how elections are fought now. A book that really opened my eyes, actually it was an op-ed based on the book, was by, and it goes back a ways now, Sasha Eisenberg. A book called The Victory Lab, and it describes a bit about how elections are won now at this level. I would go and read any of the books that were nominated for the Shaughnessy Cohen Award this year. That's a great start. There's really, one of my colleagues, Heather Schofield.
Like this one, right? We had her at the last Democracy Dialogues. It was fantastic.
I would say I have a favorite in there, a guy I've worked with a lot, who helped me a lot with my book, is Alex Marland. And Alex Marland has written a couple of really fantastic books. He is breaking new ground in political science. How political marketing, Brand Command is a very, very good book. And
Brand Command.
Anything by Alex Marland, he's a hero of mine, a lovely man, Memorial University professor, not celebrated enough for the political scientist that he is, I think.
Thank you so much for that. So now it's my pleasure to introduce John Beebe to join us, who's the founder of the Democratic Engagement Exchange, and he's going to ask the first question. So, hi, John.
Hi, thank you all for the fascinating conversation. And Susan, I appreciate the shout out to Just Vote as a starting point. So I grew up in a different political culture in the country to the south of us here, where the political discourse was really constantly about wedge issues. And coming to kind of one of the things that's really surprised me and been a bit of a revelation is you don't have to have everything driven by wedge issues. And so I guess as we listen to the debates and as we listen to the discourse in this, upcoming election, whenever exactly it takes place, like, what should we as voters be listening for to how do we make that decision? If there aren't huge differences on issues like immigration or, are there other issues that can help distinguish us, and make a distinction between the parties if we're not familiar with them? And how do we make that decision and what should we listen for?
That's such a big question. I'll give it, one of the things I like about Canadian politics versus American politics is that we have more than one choice, more than 2 choices, pardon me. That polarization, I think, is a really, really big problem. And what I saw in the United States over the last 4 years scared the bejesus out of me, frankly. It truly did keep me up at night. am not making that up. So
Yeah.
things that were happening down there, the questioning of truth and the idea, that there is no truth, that that there are no facts. That was a very scary time, and it continues a little bit too. So I think the problem is that in Canada there is so much consensus though on on that middle ground, that when we go looking for differences, we base it on personality, which is not good, right? I'm as interested and as guilty of doing personality pieces on the leaders too. But I think it often is the easiest way to find differences between them, because you're right on immigration, on so many things that are wedge issues elsewhere. They're not here. So I'm not really answering you on that, but except to say that I'm kind of protective of the idea of multiple choices here in Canada and a lack of wedge issues.
Great, John, did you want to add any more? Should we go into our
No,
audience questions?
Yeah, no, let's go to our audience questions. I think I know we have a bunch lined up, so take it away.
Okay, so I'm
Thank
going a
you
little
all.
bit out of order here, but there seems to be one that resonates with Susan's comment. So this comes from Vic. So many debates waste time debating factual information. As a viewer, it's frustrating that the moderator doesn't jump in with some fact checking so we can get back to their stance on a topic. How can we fix this or address this? Michelle, do you want to take that one?
Well, if you look at the next debate, I think people will see a difference along those lines. And, we learn from every cycle, but it was one of the big frustrations also that the moderators couldn't get in there and actually make a point in terms of facts or topics. So I think the next debates hopefully will be a better experience for everybody on that score.
The only thing I'll add to that is, from failing hands to you, I pass the torch. That was, I speak as somebody who's still suffering post-traumatic stress from that. The inability of the moderators to shut those politicians up was still wakes me up at night too. So yeah, whatever you can do about it.
It can be tough to stick handle for sure. So someone is going back to and I know we didn't get to talk about it too in depth, but really that question about voting strategically, this comes in from Sherry. How do voters deal with the political message to vote strategically? So maybe we can just give them some pathways for thinking about, when and if to do that, or the considerations. Who'd like to take that one?
No, Susan, that's your field of expertise.
I'll go back to what I said before. There's no bad reason to vote. I'm not sure that people, I think people value their vote too much to waste it in some sort of complicated calculation, or at least I hope so. So I'm less of a believer in strategic voting. I think once you get into the ballot box, you think, I've got one choice to make here. I'm not going to do it because of this happens, and a bunch of hypotheticals. So I think it's mostly a game played on political panels, not in the ballot box. I may be naive about that, but I don't think strategic voting is a huge deal here.
Okay, you heard it from one of the experts. So multiple questions are coming in on electoral reform. So to what extent would electoral reform affect the enthusiasm and engagement of new and infrequent voters? How can we build support for something like this? Or should we?
Go, Michelle.
Well, I hear this from a whole new generation, including my kids, who believe we should have a proportional system. And, in terms of political math, it would change our math for debates, and including, which parties in there would change the whole thing. On the merits of it, I think I'll pass on that one. I would like to get involved in that kind of policy issue, because I'm not supposed to. So
I'm going to throw out again a bit of a rant, but also I think there is a really easy electoral reform thing we could do tomorrow. And I am frustrated beyond belief that the government, this current government, did not do it when they had a majority. And that is bring back the per vote subsidy for a political party. It was a way of showing that parties are part of the institution of democracy. It rewarded every vote mattered, you know. So when you may know that Elizabeth May is never going to be prime minister, but you can give her Green Party $1 when you walked into that voting booth. It evened up the it evens up the landscape. You know, we may never be able to find proportional representation, but that was our sort of backdoor way of doing it. And again, if you gave me one day to lead the government, I would go in there and change that. I'd bring back the per vote subsidy. I think it was a very democratic thing, and I lament that it's gone still.
Thank you so much for that, and really to both of you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, despite I know there's a few questions in the chat that we didn't quite get to. So I endeavored, anyone we didn't get to today, I'll write to you and try to get you those answers. One thing before I say goodbye and thank yous is I'd love to plug next week's election readiness workshop that the Democratic Engagement Exchange will be holding. It's next Tuesday, July 20th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. And just to put this on your radar, this could be the last workshop before the writ is dropped. The race will be on, and we'll get, you know, we want to give you all the tools and everything in hand to get you ready to be running that race. And from doing an ecosystem scan ourselves, this seems to be the only readiness training that is available at the moment right now. So if you can take the link, register, please share in your channels and share with information with people that you're having conversations with and those who need it most. So with that in mind, I want to sincerely thank our guests today for their time and your incredible brain power as we work together to shed light on all of the issues. I also want to thank all of our audience members for staying with us for the last hour, and not just on behalf of myself, but on behalf of everyone at the Democratic Engagement Exchange. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you at the next session. Have a wonderful afternoon.